This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Another blow to Boeing. Factory workers remain on strike, rejecting the latest offer to increase wages by 35% over 4 years. Tesla triumphs. Shares surge in late trade after the EV maker posts a blowout third quarter and outlines bold 2025 ambitions. Plus, the U.S.'s Antony Blinken meets the Saudi Crown Prince in a push to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. It is just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates, 6 a.m. in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg in this week for Jumana Brzezinski. And as we've said all week, it has been busy and especially busy for markets. So let's take a look at where markets are positioned ahead of the trading day. In particular, we're paying close attention to U.S. equity futures. They're slightly popping right now, but they did remain under pressure. Stocks on Wednesday extended their losses into a third straight day. But what's been interesting is happening after hours trading. Tesla's blowout earnings really helping, giving a bit of a pop to some of the U.S. equity futures, as we can see right there. NASDAQ 100 futures up almost 0.5%. Also, we've been paying close attention to Treasury yields. They touched their highest level in almost 3 months on Wednesday, but having a bit of easing back there, as we can see right now, the 10-year yield at about 422.56. We're also watching closely Brent crude up more than 1% there. And of course, a lot of this story has been about what is happening in the Middle East as traders monitor those tensions and see how potentially that plays out into the supply and demand story for crude. So right now, crude just above $75.82 barrels. And also, if you can see on your screen, we're paying close attention to the dollar-yen cross. The yen is recovering ever so slightly. I mean, right now, just barely at that 152.36 handle. But that is after a drop to the weakest level against the dollar in almost 3 months. Those moves, following comments from BOJ Governor Ueda in D.C. So a lot happening in the markets there that we are going to continue to keep a close eye on all throughout the morning. But let's turn to this other story that we've been paying very close attention to all throughout the week. Boeing and Boeing's latest attempt to end a crippling factory worker strike has failed. Union members rejecting the company's latest labor contract offer. The union, representing some 33,000 striking workers, says 64% voted against the deal, which would have increased their wages by 35% over 4 years.
This wasn't enough for our members. We couldn't reach, especially when it's been 16 years since we've had a chance to bargain every area of our contract. And trying to make all that up in one is very hard to do, but our members deserve more. They've spoken loudly, and we're going to go back to the table to try to achieve those things.
Bloomberg's Asia aviation reporter Danny Lee is joining us now. So, Danny, this vote happening, closing just a few hours ago. I mean, talk us through really the top line that you are interpreting from this latest decision by these workers.
So Boeing is going to have to offer still a lot more because that 35% hike in wages is still nowhere near enough. And the biggest sticking point is defined benefit pensions. And for the audience out there, that's a more generous pension settlement that has increasingly been phased out over the years by corporates. And so if Boeing doesn't want to move on that, how much more does it have to move on wages? Because that 40% wage hike that members of the union really wanted, plus this defined benefit pension being reinstated, they can't get everything. And so therefore, how much more beyond potentially 40% would those union members want? And so this is a bitter blow for Boeing. And as you heard from John Holden, the union president, saying that the members deserve more and they're going to be fighting hard to get that. So we're at deadlock. We're back to square one. And as this strike continues from the 6th week into more weeks, we're going to have to see just how much more this will cost Boeing. Clearly, its financials taking a bit of a blow here.
Yeah, Danny, let's just stick on that because this is not something that Kelly Ortberg needed at this point in time. The strike had already had an impact on the plane makers' finances. I mean, what does this now potentially set Boeing up for now moving forward?
The risk is still that it has a ratings downgrade threat hanging over it, the threat of being downgraded to junk. So the longer this strike goes on for, the bigger the risk this becomes, and because of the cash burn that it continues to accumulate and build up, the fact that it cannot produce the planes in order to deliver to the customers, this really does hurt. And not only that, the fact that Boeing under Kelly Ottberg, the new leadership, have to try and right the ship and fix the wider corporate strategy and the wider business, because it has been stumbling and failing. And given the multiple crises it has endured over the last couple of years, and particularly this year, Kelly Ottberg needs to get rid of the strike and also then focus on making Boeing a much smaller, more focused and more competitive organization.
Yeah, complicated story there. Something we know you'll pay close attention to. Asia aviation reporter Danny Lee in Bangkok there starting us off. Danny, thanks so much. Let's pivot from Boeing now to Tesla. Tech is in focus today, with Tesla jumping in late trade after a surprise blowout quarter. The company's market value increased by $80 billion after the strong quarterly earnings report driven by Cybertruck sales. Elon Musk laid out bold ambitions for next year.
I do want to give some rough estimate, which is I think it's 20 to 30% vehicle growth next year. Notwithstanding negative external events.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's global business reporter, Karen Lee. So, Karen, break down the third quarter numbers for us, if you can.
Well, another big day for Elon Musk and Tesla, and I'm just getting across it here, but looking at what's bolstered this huge surge for them. Cybertruck sales, like you said, turned a profit for the first time. Energy storage business and regulatory tax credits all contributing to that. And let's look at how well Tesla's already doing. It's up 12% in post-market trading, and that could erase 14% declines we saw for the company this year. And let's also look at what Elon Musk is promising. He's promising 20 to 30% delivery growth in 2025, plans for ride sharing in Texas and California, and its dedicated robo-taxi Cybercab reaching volume production in 2026. Now, all that's made investors really happy. They're buoyed by those results, by his optimism, but let's not forget he's known for missing some timelines. So it'll be interesting to see whether they hit that and what the markets do in response.
Yeah, absolutely, Karen. As you were mentioning, I mean, promising 20 to 30% delivery growth. I mean, is Musk likely to pull this off, especially considering, as you were just mentioning there, he's missed some of his past promises?
Yeah, I mean, he has. And I mean, just looking at some of his past promises that we've written about, and in context of today, when he made a long portion of Wednesday's call, he spent a lot of it on a monologue that promised to make Tesla the most valuable company in the world. And he does want to start with that 20 to 30% delivery growth, but he does have a spotty track record. And while investors are initially optimistic, they're going to be looking at whether he can really deliver on that. And that's what time is going to tell.
All right. Karen Lee, Bloomberg's global business reporter. Karen, thanks so much for being with us and bringing us that report. Still ahead, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in an effort to push for a ceasefire in the region. We'll have the details on that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasadja in Johannesburg. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has held talks with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman about efforts to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Dan Williams, who is in Jerusalem for us. So, Dan, what, if anything, has Blinken achieved during this regional tour? We mentioned this was his 11th since the October 7th attacks. I mean, what's been the progress here?
It's rather hard to tell. It's worth noting that much of the messaging has been from the man himself rather than his hosts. What we do know is he called on Israel, which has said, and everyone's been anticipating for more than 3 weeks now, will be retaliating against Iran for Iran's ballistic missile salvo of October 1st against Israel. He's called on that not to lead to escalation. Time will tell whether such an attack would not lead to escalation given Iranian messaging on such an eventuality. He also wants a ceasefire, perhaps ideally a combined ceasefire on the Gaza and Lebanese fronts. And tomorrow, Friday, he's due to convene Arab foreign ministers, his counterparts from the region in London. Presumably, they will be discussing regional prospects. I imagine also prospects for rehabilitating Gaza on the day after Hamas. That's how Israel and its partners have been discussing the war aim of destroying, dismantling Hamas and bringing about some sort of better governance in the Gaza Strip, although it's unclear how that would look, given that Israel has yet to publicly commit or articulate a vision for the Gaza Strip.
And Dan, I mean, we've been speaking a lot about this story from, or at least I have from where I'm sitting. But you are actually there on the ground. And actually yesterday you were able to get a tour of the Israel-Lebanon border. I mean, give us a sense of what things are like on the ground.
Thank you. Yes, I was part of a group of foreign journalists. We were taken to the western sector of that border by the IDF. There were briefings by two fairly senior officers. There was regular artillery fire from Israel into Lebanon. We could see smoke at least one site where the Israelis said they had a controlled demolition of Hezbollah infrastructure. At the time, there were multiple alerts of Hezbollah attacks, specifically drone attacks, ongoing, but really limited to northern Israel. The impression the Israelis were trying to give was that they're very happy with progress on the ground. They're not quite yet ready for a ceasefire. Israel's objective, as you recall, will be to create the environment that would allow some 60,000 of its citizens to return to homes in northern Israel. These are homes they left under Hezbollah fire more than a year ago. And the Israelis say there's still work to be done. They say they've successfully driven back Hezbollah, killed or captured Hezbollah fighters where there have been engagements. However, tens of thousands of fighters remain in the Lebanese interior, they say, as well as weaponry of the kind that Israel believes could be used against it in the future unless it delivers a conclusive blow now.
And Dan, I mean, what is next to pay attention to? I mean, we mentioned some of the developments that we've seen over the past few days on the diplomatic front. We've seen strikes continuing. We're just a few weeks out from the U.S. election. I mean, what is it that you've got your eye on?
Well, I think if I were a member of the U.S. administration, I would be looking to keep a cap on whatever's going on in the Middle East. And keep in mind, this is a multi-front conflict. It's no longer the Gaza war. Gaza was where this began over a year ago. Now there's fighting on 6 or 7 different fronts, including a direct confrontation brewing between Israel and Iran. I imagine the U.S. administration is hoping, given political concerns, given the looming U.S. election, that nothing too unpredictable, nothing too unbridled will happen between now and November 5th that might upset the U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris's prospects in that election. But I think the message, quite apart from politics, and Blinken said this explicitly, is it's time for the war to end. It's time to get beyond the fighting to something that looks better and puts everyone in the region as much as possible on a better path.
Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Dan, really appreciate your reporting and for joining us this morning. Elsewhere in the Middle East, Turkey says 5 people have been killed in an attack on a state-owned defense company in the capital, Ankara, on Wednesday. It was the deadliest act of terrorism in Turkey in nearly 2 years. Officials say the KKK, a Kurdish-backed militant group, was likely behind the assault. Reports say Turkish warplanes later struck Kurdish targets in Iraq and Syria. Now, coming up, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are in a dead heat in the race for the White House. We'll discuss the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. The presidential contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris could hardly be tighter. A Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll shows the candidates are statistically tied among likely voters in each of the 7 swing states. It comes as Kamala Harris seeks to seize on a fresh warning from Trump's former White House chief of staff over his alleged praise of Hitler. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta, who is the anchor for Opening Trade. Kriti, so what can you tell us about this latest polling?
Well, as you said, it is, of course, a neck-and-neck race, but you are starting to see a slight slim margin in certain swing states. If you go deeper into the data, the biggest margin is coming out of Michigan, and that's where a Democratic candidate and Vice President Kamala Harris has a bigger lead and a bigger margin than some of these other swing states. This matters, especially in the context of some of the labor movements we're hearing out of the states, because, of course, we know Michigan is very exposed to the auto sector. It's also very exposed to courting that union vote, which, of course, Kamala Harris was able to do. 2 out of the 3 major unions in the United States endorsing her, even though President Trump, the former President Trump and Republican candidate, has been, of course, really trying to rally some of the votes in that region. That being said, you go to other places like Pennsylvania, for example, Nevada, Arizona, and it does actually have some different numbers in that President Trump seems to be making up some of the loss that he had in earlier polling. This is where he's focusing his efforts now, Jen, that Nevada and Arizona are his next major campaign stops.
And Kriti, I mean, Trump and Harris both are looking to really snap up any undecided voters or whatever is left of them. I mean, what does that strategy potentially look like for the campaign trail in the next few days?
Well, this is where it becomes even more polarizing and even more divisive, if you can believe it. I'm going to start with Kamala Harris here, just given off the heels of that town hall she had with CNN. This is really crucial because now it's all about not just courting people to actually vote, getting them to the polls, but actually courting the anti-Trump GOP vote. So Republicans who would traditionally be voting for their party, who are saying, look, President Trump does not symbolize the values of the party that I represent or that I am voting for, and therefore I'm going to switch sides, making it a very binary approach. In yesterday's town hall, she really echoed some of the comments off of John Kelly, a former member of President Trump's cabinet. Take a listen to what she had to say.
Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable. And in a second term, people like John Kelly would not be there.
So Kamala Harris making those comments outside of her residence. And this is crucial timing, Jen, simply because it's coming off the back of John Kelly, who actually invoked the idea that behind the scenes in private conversations, the president in his first term had actually praised members of Hitler's cabinet in the Nazi era. This is, of course, a major sticking point given not only the historic significance of that reference, but, of course, in the context of the war in Gaza and the Middle East as well. So this is crucial, and that Kamala Harris is really hopping onto the opportunity to court, again, the anti-Trump vote. On the flip side, this is where President Trump is trying to court, again, the voters who are saying, well, if Kamala Harris could represent a continuation of the Biden policies, even though she is VP, why didn't she speak sooner about kind of parting ways in some of the policy ideals that maybe even Democrats and even members of the Biden administration don't stand by? So that's kind of their strategy on both sides of the campaign trail.
All right. Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. Kriti, thanks so much for that report and for joining us. Let's stick on this topic and bring in senior partner at Signum Global Advisors, Lew Lukens, who is in San Francisco for us, staying up quite late. So, Lew, Kriti set us up really well there to really take a look at what the state of this race right now. We have the polls, we have the candidates who are canvassing a lot of these swing states. I mean, how would you assess where this election is at right now?
So, as you have pointed out, this is a neck-and-neck election. It is basically a tie. Kamala Harris, I think, is running slightly ahead in the national polls, but in the swing states, they're kind of evenly split, and they're all within the margin of error. And this race is going to come down to turnout, turnout, turnout. And both sides are trying as hard as they can to get their vote out there in the next 2 weeks. 25 million Americans have already voted, by the way, so voting has started across the country.
But Lew, I was taking a look at your notes and you were saying polling is almost irrelevant at this stage. I mean, how do we get a sense then of where this is going to go in the next few days?
So I think polling has got to the point that it is basically tied across the country, and those numbers are not likely to change very much in the next 10 days. And I think what we need to look at now is we're starting to look at early voting data. Not all states report a lot of data, but we have some indication of what parties people are registered for who are voting early. And we're seeing Republicans actually, after 4 years ago, Republicans did not vote early. In great numbers. Donald Trump convinced his party that early voting was sort of shady and suspect. But this year we're seeing Republicans voting, and they're voting ahead of Democrats in Nevada and in North Carolina. But the other interesting data point that we're seeing women voting in really large numbers in Georgia, in Michigan, and in North Carolina. And those are states that are going to decide this election. And, the question will be, are these women voting for Kamala Harris because they care about abortion rights and other issues, or are they voting for Donald Trump? And we won't know the answer to that till after the election. But I think that the high number of women voting is generally a good sign for Democrats.
Do you think, Lew, what do you think then the obstacles are for both of these candidates? Kriti was walking us through what we heard from the vice president about how she was reacting to President or former President Trump. Is the messaging working for both sides? Well,
Kamala Harris is trying to do two things right now. She's trying to convince voters that Donald Trump is a danger to the country and that they should not reelect him to the office of the president. And she's also trying to lay out her agenda. And she spent time doing both of those things at that town hall meeting at CNN last night. She was talking about her plans, her tax plans, her plans for the opportunity economy. But she also spent a lot of time going after Donald Trump, calling him unhinged, referring to John Kelly's revelations about Donald Trump's sort of infatuation with Hitler and his generals. So she's trying to do both of those things at the same time. And I think she did a pretty effective job, honestly, tonight at the CNN town hall.
Lew, before we let you go, I wonder if we could get your take on what many people are calling the Trump trade. Are the markets getting too ahead of themselves? How are you interpreting some of the moves that we're seeing just a few days out from the election?
Look, Trump, there's been a shift in the polls over the last 2 weeks, slightly in Trump's favor. And I think people are looking at that and assuming that he's going to win this election and making trades based on that. We think at Signum that Kamala Harris is going to win this election. We think at the end of the day that the turnout will be robust enough from the core constituencies of the Democratic Party, young voters, women voters, African-American voters, to take her over the edge and she'll win this election. So, but I understand why there's a mood out there, a sense that Donald Trump is going to run away with this. We disagree with that, but I see what people are doing.
We'll leave it there. Lew Lukens, senior partner at Signum Global Advisors. Lew, great to get your insights. Thanks so much for staying up late for us. And just a quick clarification to a report we brought you earlier this hour on the attack on Wednesday in Ankara. Officials say the PKK, a Kurdish-backed militant group, was likely behind the assault, which killed 5 people. We have more news coming up, including the Fed's Beige Book, which reveals little growth across most of the U.S. We'll discuss the economy next. This is Bloomberg. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Another blow to Boeing. Factory workers remain on strike, rejecting the latest offer to increase wages by 35% over 4 years. Tesla triumphs. Shares surge in late trade after the EV maker posts a blowout third quarter and outlines bold 2025 ambitions. Plus, the U.S.'s Antony Blinken meets the Saudi crown prince in a push to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates, 6:30 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg in this week for Jumana Bersetchi. It has been a busy week. It is already shaping up to be a busy day. And let's take a look at where markets are right now. We're seeing U.S. equity futures slightly in the green, and that is coming off of a Wednesday where they did see losses extending. Potentially this pop, though, is coming after we saw that blowout earnings from Tesla. We were just mentioning that there. That actually helping to send share prices up more than 10% in after-hours trading, potentially giving a bump then to the NASDAQ 100. We're also, as we have been all week, paying close attention to Treasury yields, to government bonds, and in particular in the U.S. On Wednesday, they touched their highest level in almost 3 months, pulling back ever so slightly, though, this morning. Right now, the U.S. 10-year yield at 421.77. And crude crude jumping this morning. Look at how big we're seeing the moves this morning, up more than 1%, though it's still in the middle of recent ranges. Of course, we've been saying traders have been assessing what is happening in the Middle East and its impact on crude. And our MLive team is actually suggesting there may be more volatility to come in the coming weeks for oil. So paying close attention to that. Let's check in, though, on how markets in Asia are faring. A lot of moves over there. Avril Hong is standing by in our Singapore studio. Hey, Avril.
Hey, Jen. Yeah, it's a mostly negative day, 2 weeks out from the U.S. election. Those jitters are subduing or, denting some of the risk appetite. The region's benchmark headed for its fourth session of declines as Chinese sentiment turns as well, reversing the gains from a day ago. And that is despite some of the gains that we're seeing among chip makers, notably SK Hynix, after record profits that were powered by AI demand. Keeping a close watch on the yen as well, that is snapping a 3-session losing streak against the greenback. And if you take a look at this next chart, though, it will inform you of just what traders are bracing for. If you take a look at the 2-week implied volatility, which of course encompasses the Fed, the BOJ decision, but also the US and Japan elections, it shows how it has jumped to the highest level since the start of this month. So it just shows you what traders are kind of watching out for, that volatility expected. Jen.
Thanks so much, Avril Hong in Singapore for us. Let's check on the markets. The Fed's Beige Book survey of regional business contacts has shown economic activity was flat in most parts of the U.S. since early September. Meanwhile, the looming presidential election could be fueling the dollar pace towards its best month since 2022. Let's bring in Katrina Ell, Director of Economic Research for Moody's Analytics in Sydney. So, Katrina, let's just start maybe with this Fed Beige Book that we got. Slight and modest increases in employment and prices was just some of the notes that we got from this Beige Book. I mean, how are you interpreting its sentiment around the U.S. economy right now?
I think it's really interesting, the point around sentiment, because what we're seeing is that the macroeconomic backdrop for the U.S. economy, however you slice it, is upbeat. We've got GDP growth on track to grow about 2.7% this year. Labor market, you could argue we're pretty much at full employment right now. So everything's looking positive. Now we've also got rate cuts coming through. We've got that 50 basis points. We'll get more before the end of this year. So everything's kind of positive. But at the same time, if we look, hone in on consumer sentiment, business sentiment, it's not that crash hot. And there is a bit of a disconnect. And it does really point to risk, because if we see, say, consumers or businesses lose faith, then this resilient economy that we've seen through this tightening cycle could lose momentum. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, particularly heading into this really close US election race. If we see more uncertainty coming out of this election, then that could drive more of a pullback in sentiment, and that might flow through to, say, consumer spending behavior, which has really been a key source of resilience for the US economy through this tightening cycle, or we might see a pullback in business investment as well.
Well, and Katrina, what does that mean then for the dollar's dominance? We heard a number of central bank governors this week speaking about currencies and EM currencies and not to discount them. I mean, could the dollar potentially then be headed for a pullback?
I mean, it's hard to say at this point. I think at the end of the day that the dollar is still a source of strength in volatility, and it's still an attractive asset to be holding in such a volatile environment. But I think because we're seeing, EMs tread very carefully when it comes to easing back on policy, I think they'll be very cognizant of what happens with the dollar. And they're watching it very closely as well. We have seen some EM strength coming out of Asia recently. And while that might be a positive thing for, say, imported inflation, they're also quite concerned about it on the flip side from an export perspective, from a merchandise export perspective, and also services as well. Because of that strength, it is starting to hurt competitiveness if it's sustained on a longer term basis. So it will be interesting to see, but I think this US election and the near-term volatility that we are seeing does definitely support a stronger greenback.
And Katrina, I mean, let's just stick on the IMF because they also came out with a report this week that actually says, that they expect a bigger share of growth over the next few years to come from BRICS nations. BRICS, of course, happening this week than their prediction 6 months ago. I mean, what do you think the change was, especially as you mentioned Asia there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think what we're seeing is this bigger realization of economies, particularly like India, for instance. That's a growth powerhouse, and we're really it's become a positive story, particularly as the China bears have become more out in force. We're seeing incredibly strong growth out of India this year, expected to be somewhat sustained next year. They have a very strong infrastructure pipeline. We're getting strong investment numbers, for instance, out of India. It's really domestically driven growth, which is a really positive story. And I think, China, while China does have those considerable structural challenges, particularly around the property market, overall, the growth projection of around 5% this year, about 4.7%, 4.8% next year is still quite upbeat, and it still does pale, a positive picture of those, some of those BRICS economies, certainly.
Does that mean then China's recent measures then go far enough, or do you think there is going to need to be more to actually indicate that the reversal has actually happened?
I think that, that's really the million-dollar question at the moment. We think that the measures that have been announced over the past couple of weeks do really make a positive move in terms of making sure that China will meet its growth target. But it's really important to keep looking beneath the surface of those growth targets. We don't think the stimulus measures do enough to address the structural challenges in the economy. They certainly don't do enough to arrest the sustained correction in the property market that we're seeing. Those forward indicators, around new developments are still turning negative. So we need to see further measures, and not just on the property market either. We need to see more support coming for the consumer. Consumer confidence in China is still incredibly weak. It's just as weak as it was when it was subject to pandemic-related restrictions. So that tells us that the government needs to do much more than it has to support the consumer, particularly around the jobs market as well, which remains a source of weakness and a reason for why the consumer just is keeping that precautionary savings incredibly elevated.
Katrina, I want to finish on comments again that we're hearing at the IMF from BOE governor and also the ECB chief. I mean, what do you make of some of the recent comments? Andrew Bailey saying that he's now calling into question the UK's inflation path just weeks after saying that he was potentially hinting at aggressive rate cuts. I mean, what does this mean for both of these central banks?
I think what we're seeing is this increased awareness of the fact that the growth recovery out of Europe is incredibly weak, and we do need to see increased support. But in a place like the UK, it's increasingly difficult because from a fiscal stimulus point of view, there's no space there. We will see ongoing fiscal consolidation heading into next year. So it's just this unfortunate situation. If we look at Eurozone, for instance, the consumer just isn't getting out there and spending as much as what would have been hoped in the final months of this year and heading into next year. So there is the overwhelming concern that are the aggressive rate cuts coming out of both these central banks going to be sufficient to drive more of a recovery? And at this point, it doesn't seem like it's going to be enough at this point.
Katrina Ell, Director of Economic Research for Moody's Analytics. Katrina, great to get your insights this morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, here's a look at a few other stories we're following today. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have met on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Russia. Xi told Modi the two countries should properly manage their differences over disputed Himalayan borders. It's their first bilateral meeting since 2022 after easing a 4-year border standoff earlier this week. Vladimir Putin says the BRICS grouping shows that a multipolar world is being created to challenge the U.S.-dominated global order. The Russian president hosted leaders of the newly expanded bloc this week. Putin says more than 30 nations are interested in joining the group, but current members are split over the idea of further expansion.
The BRICS states stand united in their support for intensifying cooperation in the global arena based on the key principles of the UN Charter and jointly strive to contribute in every possible way to the formation of a fair multipolar world order with the decisive participation of the countries of the global south and east in the systems of international governance.
And U.S. officials say North Korea is sending troops to Russia, confirming the movements for the first time. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says about 3,000 North Koreans are training at 3 sites in Russia. And Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says there's a serious possibility they will be sent into combat.
We are seeing evidence that there are North Korean troops that have gone to Africa. Now, what exactly? Not Africa, but Russia. What exactly they're doing, left to be seen. These are things that we need to sort out. We'll have more for you on that later. But yeah, as we continue to look at this, there is evidence that there are DPRK troops, in Russia.
And coming up, Mozambique is bracing for final election results amid escalating violence, allegations of fraud, and the killing of the opposition's lawyer. Stay tuned for all of those details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasadja in Johannesburg. Let's turn our focus to Mozambique, which is bracing for final election results amid fears of escalating violence. This coincides with the start of a 2-day national shutdown that the opposition candidate has called for after alleging election fraud and the murder of his legal advisor. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Matthew Hill, who's joining us now from Cape Town and has been following this closely. So, Matthew, general elections were held back on October 9th. I mean, what is the expectation for when we'll actually know the final results?
Well, after more than 2 weeks of waiting to see who's won the elections, Mozambicans will finally this afternoon get the final result. The Elections Commission announced yesterday that they'll start announcing the results from 2:30 p.m. local time this afternoon.
And Matt, I mean, that's the timeline there. But really, the big story here has been the tensions in the country over this vote. I mean, give us some context as to how we got to this point.
Yeah, that's a very important point. The country was already tense throughout the past 2 weeks as the results were getting counted and the preliminary provisional results were coming in showing that the ruling party candidate Daniel Shapo was well ahead. His biggest challenger, Venancio Mondlane from the opposition, he stood as an independent candidate and was quick to reject the provisional results that were coming out, claiming that they were fraudulent and claiming that he was the real winner of the elections. Those tensions were only escalated at the weekend when Mondlane, the opposition candidate's lawyer, was gunned down in the capital Maputo, along with another senior official from the opposition, and that really ratcheted things up.
Yeah, to a point that's actually a bit concerning if we take a look at some of the pictures. I mean, Matt, when it comes to the investor story, Mozambique is pretty important to investors because of its natural resources. I mean, does what we're seeing this week potentially put those in jeopardy?
Well, if you look at the pricing activity of Mozambique's dollar bonds this week, they've fallen. Which does indicate that investors are getting a bit nervous about the political situation in the country. But there's also the massive LNG projects, liquefied natural gas projects that Mozambique has in its far north, involving companies like Total Energies, and they'll be certainly watching the election outcome very closely along with its aftermath. The CEO of Total Energies, Patrick Pouyanné, has already indicated that he plans to visit Mozambique in the next weeks to discuss with the next the presidential candidate who comes out victorious, to find out what his policies will be around those liquefied natural gas projects.
Right. A lot of attention that we're paying close to, as are you. Thanks so much, Matthew Hill in Cape Town, for us with that report. Now, here's a look at some other stories we are following today in the region. Nigeria's president has fired 5 ministers in his first cabinet shakeup since taking office last year. Bola Tinubu says the overhaul will reinvigorate his administration as he works to deliver his promises to Nigerians. Since taking office, the government has introduced sweeping reforms, including allowing the naira to trade more freely and cutting fuel and electricity subsidies. Staying in Nigeria, and a court has ordered the release of a Binance executive standing trial on allegations of money laundering and currency manipulation. The charges against that executive were dropped on health grounds. The face-off between Nigeria and the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange burst into public view in February when Nigerian authorities detained Gambarian and a colleague. And let's bring you some breaking news that we are following today. We have been talking about all of the earnings that we're getting today, and we just got one from Equinor. Of course, that is a very important energy company in Europe. They reported adjusting operating income after tax for the third quarter that actually beat the average analyst estimate. As you can see there, the estimate was $2 billion, and they were just over $2 billion. They also reported their adjusted operating income at $6.89 billion. Slightly below the estimate, which was $7.23 billion. We heard a bit from the company, and we'll continue to hear from them. They said, over time, we have upgraded the capacity in the gas value chain. We've also been paying close attention to what's been happening with Equinor's latest portfolio in the sea. All right, coming up, tariffs versus innovation. Bill Gates says tariffs do more harm than good for society and innovation. We hear why next. This is Bloomberg. Bill Gates, founder and chair of the Gates Foundation, says tariffs are a barrier to high-speed innovation and push up prices. Speaking at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Sao Paulo to Bloomberg News editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite, Gates also discussed climate change and the role of government.
You have things, particularly industrial emissions like steel, cement, that we're just building the pilot plants now. And so without governmental policy and support, the transition of the industrial emissions would slow down a lot. And, you know, that's very unfortunate if that takes place. Likewise, in transportation, airlines are, you know, the toughest part of all of the emissions, and they're, you know, without support, that'll get pushed back.
Can I ask you one kind of strangely capitalism-related question? I mean, you have arguably been one of the world's, well, you've definitely been one of the world's most successful capitalists of the past 25, 30, 40 years. Last week, I sat on a stage with Donald Trump, and he said that he wanted to introduce tariffs, 10, 20% on everywhere, and his argument was this was very good for American business. In your experience, does that make sense?
No, it's certainly not the case, and the difficulty of convincing voters that free trade is overwhelmingly to their benefit. It's unfortunate how difficult it is to make that case. And so, you know, I understand the politician who chooses to take advantage of that, but, you know, we will suffer overall. Welfare will improve less, as not only will, if the U.S. puts tariffs on, of course, other people will put tariffs on as well, and the economic dynamism and speed of innovation will be significantly slowed.
Just to push you on that dynamism point, you know, it's very easy to make the argument that this means higher prices for consumers, but this issue of dynamism, the sort of, you've been involved in entrepreneurship, these things most of your life. If you have less foreign competition, less foreign goods, that must have an impact on it. I know it's back to a creed you've believed in, but in practice, is that argument possible to make to voters?
Well, we should find articulate politicians who can make the case. If you take most of the industries I think about, like, inventing a new drug or writing a new piece of software or birthing a new climate technology, you have these gigantic fixed costs. And the fact that you can do that work and then sell it on a global basis means that everybody's getting, faster innovation and lower prices. And if you start to fragment markets because of either tariffs or regulatory barriers to that trade, it absolutely takes away the lower prices and high-speed innovation.
That was Bill Gates, founder and chair of the Gates Foundation at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Now that's Horizon's Middle East and Africa for this Thursday. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. Stick with us for Daybreak Europe and all throughout the day. This is Bloomberg.